If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this, campers, hunters, etc., what's the most eerie, unsettling thing/creature you've ever encountered in the woods? I have a story about something I heard that scared the shit out of me. I was on a student exchange program to the US, specifically New Mexico. I'm not from the US, BTW. And near the end of my stay, my host family, the dad, mom, me, and their 2 daughters, decided to go camping. When it was getting dark, 16-year-old me and the 2 daughters decided to go climb a tree a bit away from the campsite, and when we reached the top of the tree, we stopped dead in our tracks because of a sound I'll never forget. The youngest daughter, who was 14 years old, was calling my name, which is a typical Dutch name, so not something some New Mexican locals would just shout since they have trouble pronouncing it. The thing was, this girl was sitting just below me, not saying a word. We sat there as this thing, whatever it was, kept shouting my name in her voice for what felt like an eternity but was actually just 5 minutes. And when it stopped, we bolted back to the campsite, where mom and dad were sitting, just enjoying the evening. But when we told them, the dad's face became pale as a ghost and he immediately told us to grab our things because we were leaving, and 5 minutes later we were gone. To this day, I still have no idea what that was, and my dad never wanted to talk about it. A few years ago, a group of friends and I went camping together. The campground we wanted to go to was full, so we ended up camping deep into the forest, several miles away from any other campers. Well, the first night, we woke up at about 2 in the morning to drum and sing. It sounded like a traditional Native American type of song and music. I don't know how to describe it, but I got the feeling that something was very wrong. It was like the feeling you get when something bad happens. And the sound didn't sound like it was coming from anywhere in particular but was just all around us. Anyway, we were completely freaked out and decided to sleep in our car. The next night, we decided to go see if we could find any other campers near us that may have made the noise. We literally saw no sign of life anywhere around us, and we were in a somewhat clear part of the forest, so if anyone was camped near us, we would have seen them. We were still freaked out but decided it was probably nothing, so we spent another night. That night we woke up at the same time again to loud music, but it sounded closer this time. We also felt like something was just wrong and were extremely freaked out. We were too freaked out to go to sleep, so we just stayed in our tent awake all night. The next day, when we woke up, we decided to pack up and see if the other campground was open, and it was. When we stayed there, nothing else happened. To this day, I really don't have an explanation for what that noise was. I don't understand how we could not have seen any other campers and why they would have played music in the middle of the night. We also weren't on tribal land. My best friend, who was one of the other campers, is Navajo, and she said the music was similar to music she heard in tribal dances and rituals. I'm still freaked out about the whole ordeal, and it's hard to explain, but my body was just telling me that something was very wrong when this was happening. I went camping on top of the mountain one time. In the middle of the night, we were forced to break camp and hike down the mountain in the dark. So many things about this were not ideal and were probably dangerous, but we did what we had to do. So we packed up and headed down the mountain in the dark. We had flashlights, but they only helped so much. It was cloudy, so there was no moonlight either. But the trail was well defined, so we weren't worried about getting lost. Parts of the mountain are really steep and narrow, so the National Park Service kindly built a few sets of stairs into the mountain in those extra tight spots. On either side of each was a cliff. So the only way up and down the mountain was over these 2 staircases. One was about halfway up, and the other was about 3/4 up. So I'm in the dark on the way down. We didn't really have a way to judge distance on the mountain except by those stairs. So we knew that when we came to the second set, we would be roughly halfway. Only we never cross any stairs. At all. I spent the whole time down the mountain thinking any minute now I'd come across them, but no. Not a single solitary stair. It's not possible that I missed them, went around them, or any of that. There's one way up and one way down, and somehow we made it all the way from the top to the car without seeing a single stair. I have no idea how, but it was really unsettling. We both noticed it, but neither of us mentioned it until we were halfway home because we were too freaked out by the whole thing. A few years ago, we had a big church camping trip. It was on one of those 100-person campsites you need to reserve a year in advance that's pretty isolated out. Anyway, I'm up pretty late, chatting before finally calling it a night. It was around 1 a.m., and only 3 other people were still up, my friend and 2 older gentlemen who were still talking away. I go to my tent and fall asleep almost instantly. Anyway, I wake up in the morning, and here's the story I hear. Apparently, About 15 minutes after I fell asleep, my friend heard screams that sounded like help. Everyone else quieted down, and they too heard what sounded like distant yelling, although they couldn't make out what. They took a light and made a quick 5-minute walk in the direction of the sound, but nothing happened. My friend swears it sounded like someone screaming for help. It's possible, but I don't know how likely. The main road was about 20 minutes away, and the only way to our campsite was a single road. There was no reason to be anywhere near our site unless you were camping there. No attractions, rivers, etc. Even for hunting, you would be better off going deeper and further out. The next night, we stood up again, but this time nothing. This didn't happen to me, but to my dad when he was a teen. He used to live out in the middle of nowhere in British Columbia, and his dad ran a trapping business. One winter, his dad sent my dad out to check on the traps alone. It was a 2-day trip, and they had a small cabin set up to rest in overnight. My dad skied all day and finally arrived at the cabin around nightfall. He quickly got into bed and fell asleep. He woke up suddenly in the middle of the night because there was something walking in the fresh snow outside. Let me remind you that this is literally nowhere. There were no roads for miles and miles, and only a single trail my dad and his dad had cleared. As my dad lay there, listening, he realized it must be something big, like a grizzly or moose. Then it passes the window. My dad couldn't see clearly, as it was a small window set high in the wall, and he was lying down, but whatever it was walking upright like a human but was way larger. Then it left. My dad went out the next morning and checked for tracks everywhere, but there was nothing. Now, my dad never said outright what he thought it was, and I'm not going to jump to conclusions, but I've asked if it could have been a dream or just another person, and he is adamant that it was neither. This happened about 20 years ago while hunting with my dad in northern BC. It was a cold October morning, and it was still dark when we parked the truck and started our hike into a clear cut. I was familiar with the area, as we had moose hunted there before. My dad went left, and I went right, and I made my way to the top of a slope to get a better view of the clear cut. I found a stump to sit on, took out my binoculars, and quickly found my dad in the clear cut across the mountain. As soon as I spotted him, I heard something heavy move behind me in the forest, roughly 40 yards away. I'm thinking, yes, a moose. I then head towards the forest edge when I hear a scream or screech unlike anything I've ever heard. It didn't sound human and wasn't like any animal I've heard before. It was so loud, and I swear my soul left my body for a few seconds. I turned around and ran down the clear-cut hill as fast as my teenage legs would take me. When I got to my dad, he said he had heard it too and found me in his binoculars running down the clear cut. He then looked up at the forest edge and said he saw a big, hairy human-like creature standing about 8 feet tall between 2 birch trees. It stayed for a few seconds, then turned around and was way gone. We got in the truck and went home for the day. We asked elders and relatives about it when we got back, and they called them the forest guardians. It still scares the hell out of me. I was camping with some high school friends back in the 80s. We were about 6 miles down a newly built dirt logging road in some deep and previously unexplored forest. We built a campfire, and some of us were drinking pretty heavily, so one of the guys got out a tape recorder to embarrass us later. Sometime after midnight, our revelry was interrupted by the loudest, scariest bass-toned roar we'd ever heard. None of us have ever heard anything like it to this day. It was louder and deeper than any black bear roar, and there were almost no bears around here anyhow. Only our teenage bravado and the advanced state of drunkenness of some of us kept us from leaving in fright. But we did put out our campfire and stay in our cars that night. The kicker is that this roar was caught on tape. You could tell from the echo that it was a sound clearly from a distance, but it was still so loud that it caused the recording to distort. Truly frightening. Sadly, the tape was lost long ago. Not too long after that, we started hearing stories of people encountering Bigfoot on the local section of the Appalachian Trail. I have no idea if that was Bigfoot we heard, and I'm very skeptical about anything like that, but I'm sure it was no bear we heard. Last year in late summer, 2 friends and I went camping in BC in a pretty populated campsite. It was supposed to be a super chill evening. We had cooked some food, were sharing a bottle of wine, and stayed up late chatting. The time was about 1 a.m., and we were probably the only people awake at the site as everything was silent around us. All of a sudden, we heard this thumping running sound towards us, and this feeling of dread sank into our bones. I have never been more afraid in my life. What was funny was that at first we thought it was a man, but it must have been huge, as the ground itself shook. It was pitch black, and we had lights on around us, so we couldn't see much beyond our area. Whatever it was charged for lasted us at full speed, and we heard a huge crash into the river beside our site. We ran and hid in the car and assumed it was a bear. Even now, when we talk about it, we are still not completely sure, as nothing could begin to describe the feeling of terror we each felt just before we heard the footsteps. To this day, it was the scariest thing that ever happened to me. I was about 13 or 14. My dad, my uncle, my little cousin, and I were on a dirt bike/quad trip up the trails surrounding the Goat River, beside Creston, BC. We had finished most of our riding for the day, and we found a quaint little camping spot next to the river. It was probably 5 or 6 p.m. not dark, but not super bright either. We had a campfire going, with some fish we'd managed to catch cooking over it. My cousin, who was probably around 10 years old, wandered over to the river. We heard him calling for us to come over because he saw a dog. The adults and I hastily sprint over because we knew it probably wasn't a dog and was most likely a coyote eyeing up the child for a quick snack. What we found wasn't exactly a coyote but could only be described as eerily close. It was longer, slender, had big eyes, and, to top it off, stood upright on its hind legs. It didn't look like a dog standing on its hind legs, though. It looked humanoid in stature. It was just staring at us, never once looking away. Looking at it longer, its face didn't seem to be canine in any capacity. It had human-esque features with a fur-covered body. My dad and uncle both seemed frightened. My uncle grabbed my cousin and put him on top of their quad, while my dad told me to get my backpack and my tent bag and that we weren't staying in the woods that night. As my uncle walked back towards the campsite, the thing across the river started walking towards us. It took long strides into the quick-moving water without any sign of struggling from the currents. As soon as it got to about waist deep, my dad turned to me and yelled, "We've got to go, and we've got to go now." We dashed back to our camp. My uncle and cousin were both on their quads, and my dad yelled, "Leave your shit, just turn the bike on and get out." My uncle and I revved up our engines and peeled out of there as fast as we could, with my dad following shortly behind us. My dad's a very stoic and composed individual. We raced back to our trucks, which must have taken 2 to 3 hours in the pitch black. Once we got back, my dad claimed that he saw it sprinting behind us as we drove away. It must have been going over 30 or 50 kilometers an hour, and it was running on 2 legs. My dad's Native American, we're actually Iroquois Indian, and he swore that what we saw was a skinwalker or something else. Either way, I've never been that terrified in my life, and I've never seen my father more shaken than that night. I went hiking with a friend in early 2019. We hiked in the woods this time to try something new. We were walking for at least 30 minutes when we heard rustling in the bush a few feet in front of us. A deer came out and didn't look normal. It had no tail, and its ears were so small they almost weren't visible, plus the eyes were abnormally large. I even thought it was some kind of goat. The deer was just standing there, staring at us. It started walking closer, and I noticed its eyes weren't brown or anything. They were red. A dark, piercing red. I didn't feel threatened or anything, but I was pretty scared. My friend, who was literally shaking, just stood still beside me. When it got too close for comfort, he grabbed me and just ran. All I did was follow him. I don't know what happened after we ran off, but I don't want to make contact with that thing anymore, or even anything like it. I had a campfire going, and me and 3 other guys decided to leave this other guy and girl, who were going out, by the campfire and explore the woods. The guy in front has a duck-off mag light, the kind the police over in the colonies use. Guy number 2 was filming in night vision for shits and G's. The path through the woods meant we had to walk single file, and night vision didn't want to go last because he was pretty freaked out, so I told him I would. We're walking through the woods, pitch black, but for this mag light, which is facing forward. Scaring each other and freaking each other out. There's a murderer in these woods watching us. All of a sudden, we hear an almighty log somewhere off to our right being cracked. This wasn't no branch falling off, no tree, no badger stepping on a twig. This was a big-ass log being thunderclapped in twain. We all paused and looked off into the darkness. Maglight slowly brings the torch around. We see a shape somewhere off in the dark. Not a tree. Not some small woodland creature. A big ducking lumbering mass. This is the west of England, mind, and we don't get anything bigger than a deer in our woodlands. Whatever the shape was, it was massive. Needless to say, by this point I was already sprinting back the way we came, laughing maniacally because if I didn't laugh, I'd have dropped to the ground, grabbed my knees, and blubbered like a little girl with a skinned knee. Night vision notices I'm gone, and with a "goddammit." He's off after me, the other 2 behind us, screaming and hollering. We got back to the campfire and told the others, but they didn't believe us. We felt pretty safe out in the open, so we stayed put. I have never been able to explain the shape in the dark. I once stayed in a cabin in Arkansas, facing the river. One side of the cabin was almost all windows with no blinds or anything, which made me feel really creeped out, especially the first time it got dark and you couldn't see out. The first night we stayed there, this beating started on all sides of the cabin. It was loud and eerily fast-paced, moving from one wall to the next to the roof, etc. A few times the gas-powered fireplace would roar up and then go out, the TV would turn on and just be static, really cliché stuff. We would also hear whispering at night, and because I was too much of a poon to sleep with the lights off after the first night, we left the hall light on and the bedroom door shut and locked, till we started seeing shadows under the door, got the duck out of there. I don't know if the place was poorly built or if people were messing with us or what, but the shadows under the door were way too much for me. Camping is fun as hell, though, give it a chance. Despite being scared as hell, this is one of my fondest camping memories. When I was a kid, I had a crappy Honda 254-wheeler. My friend's dad owned the apartments I lived in. He let me have it there. I would ride to his house or meet him in the woods by the apartments. We had trails everywhere all day in the summer. People started using the trails for walking, they were so good. One day, we made a new trail. We stopped when we found 2 cement blocks on the side of a hill. After a couple weeks, we got curious and chained them up and pulled them down, and it was the back of a school bus. Like a bus door. It was buried, and it had no seats and a big steering wheel like a 1950s model. Inside, we found baby dolls and burned candles. Just when we're leaving, this guy goes, "What are you all doing?" We turned to look, and he had lipstick smeared all over his mouth. We hauled out there. We never went back to that area of our woods. We were scared. I was around 15 to 16, with 6 or 7 of my best friends and some girlfriends of one or another. All of us kids went camping for an extended weekend. So we went to this far away campsite by one of my friend's grandpa's farms. It had a small creek, a large treeless place where we set up our tents, and it was surrounded by large, dense woods. At one point, 3 days in, we only had one working flashlight. It was getting dark, so we obviously thought, let's play hide and seek in the middle of the woods. What could possibly go wrong? So, the players hid in the woods, and the seeker went looking for them with a flashlight. Alright, when I finally was the seeker, it was already too dark for the flashlight to light up anything, so we were all like, okay, this is the last one, then we light up the fireplace, eat, and go sleep. So, after some time, I found everyone except for this one dude, let's call him Danny. So everyone is at the campsite, waiting for the 2 of us. I was looking for quite some time, so I went back to see if he was there. He was not. People start getting worried, so we all go looking for him. We even got torches because, again, only my flashlight was working. We did not find Danny. Everyone goes back to the fireplace and figures let's just wait for him here. If he doesn't come back, we will look for him in the morning light, but for some reason I still felt like looking, and a few of my friends too, so me and 2 or 3 were still in the woods. We were all quietly freaking out. It was super late now, I couldn't see anything outside the flashlight's range. At some point during my desperate search, my flashlight shines on someone just outside its range, crunching behind a tree, so I scream, "Oi lads, I found Danny. He's here. Get out from behind this tree, Danny. I see you. It's no fun anymore. Come on mate." Then I hear a shout from the camp, "Danny is here already, you can stop looking," and I go, "What do you mean he is there?" I'm looking right at him, he's wearing his white shirt and all. I can see it. IT reflects light, you know, Danny? Get out of there, I found you, mate. That's when it hits me, Danny was wearing a red shirt. I get this feeling of dread in my chest and go running as fast as I can back to camp. He was there. After that, nobody wanted to stay the last day there, so we all went back home in the morning. I still hate camping. 25 years ago or so, I saw eyes in the darkness of the trees when I shined a flashlight out. It seemed kind of high up. They were red reflecting. We also had sticks and rocks occasionally thrown into our camp. Nothing big, and it was directed at the fire. Eventually it stopped, and we went to bed. There were 4 of us. I'm a light sleeper, and so is my dad. We both woke up to footsteps and a really bad stink about 5 a.m. My dad shook the side of the tent and yelled, "Get the duck out here." Whatever it was, it ran off. Cowlitz Country, Washington. In August of 2019, I loaded a bunch of camping gear onto my bicycle and spent the better part of the next 7 months riding 5,300 miles around the US. I often preferred to just disappear into the woods at night, camping somewhere where people were unlikely to find me and even less likely to care that I was there. After a month of this, I had grown quite accustomed to the sounds of a forest at night. The constant droning of crickets and toads became a comfort to me, and it was always a highlight of the night, though not particularly uncommon, to hear the yips and howls of distant coyotes. One of my favorite moments of the whole trip was the night spent camping right between two owls, who hooted back and forth through much of the night. Then there was one September night in Montana. There were no crickets or toads, nor coyotes or owls. There wasn't even the babbling of a nearby creek or a breeze through the dry leaves of early autumn still clinging to the trees. It was completely silent. During those 7 months, I learned to sleep through a lot. There was a night I set up camp just 10 feet from some very active train tracks. In one night at a hostel, I had a roommate who loudly snored and a bunkmate who talked in his sleep. I pitched my tent in a Walmart parking lot, and I spent a night in the tent with food poisoning, occasionally vomiting out the door of the tent. But that night in the silent forest of Montana was the worst night's sleep out of the 179 nights. I can only describe it as the loudest silence I've ever heard. The occasional snapping of a twig or similar sounds that would normally get lost in the cacophony of the forest on that night sounded as loud as those freight trains. And it felt as if the entire forest was trying to hide from an equally silent predator. It was incredibly unnerving, and the next morning, I could not get out of there soon enough. I live in the Pacific Northwest. I love to go on night hikes alone. I almost never used my flashlights, because once your eyes acclimatize to the moonlight, you can see better without them. Anyway, I would try not to let my mind wander whenever I thought that I was hearing something out of the ordinary, like this whispering. I always kept my mind solid, thinking of relaxing subjects and so on. It was autumn, and the leaves were falling in full force. I was almost to my favorite spot. It must have been around 1 p.m. I was walking uphill towards the overlook when I heard leaves crunching. It sounded near, but I couldn't estimate which direction. There are these huge boulders nearby, and as I passed them, I heard small rocks crumbling from them. Again, it was indistinct and very strange sounding. Metallic sounding. Hard to describe. It immediately gave me the shivers. Something strange is happening, I thought. I should leave now. I had my flashlight on at this point, ignoring my normal no light rule. It's a 1000 lumen beast of a light. I'm heading back, and just in the peripheral cone of the light, I see a shadowy blip. Like a dark, hazy, or smoky moving shadow. I caught like 5 seconds of it, and it was gone. It didn't leave me, the haze was there, then went transparent, then disappeared. I remembered just when I was telling myself that it was nothing, I heard leaves crunching in the same direction, moving irregularly. Fast, fast, slow, fast, slow, slow, something like that. About 15 feet to my left. I ran about half a mile to the junction before collecting myself and nervously listening behind me all the way to the car. In high school, some friends and I would often cruise the back roads of our small town, break into an abandoned house, and use our video camera to capture ghost videos. One night we drove by a very deep ravine that was dried up and the ground was covered in leaves. I said we should check it out and see who would go furthest into the ravine. 3 of us went in, and the other 3 stayed behind, saying it was way too scary to check out. While we were walking, we saw an empty gallon jug, then came across a piece of blue clothing, then some other trash. We didn't have the flashlight on to add to the effect, we just turned it on every now and then to see things better. The moon was full, but it was very hard to see because of all the tree coverage. Suddenly, a cold chill ran down my back, and I felt like we weren't alone. I froze, and my friends stopped immediately with me. I know they felt what I felt. We could hear a rush of branches breaking and leaves crunching. It was all around us at the top of the ravine. My friend shined his light, and we could see people rushing all around us. We turned around and ran the way we came. Just into darkness. I'm so amazed none of us fell. We got to the car and started pounding on it. We jumped in, and I got into the driver's seat, and we floored it out of there. We were deep in the woods, about 20 miles from town, but rushed home, and all of us were talking at once. We have been warned before by authorities to stay out of the woods because terrible things happen there. But we didn't listen. Things could have ended much differently for us. We are lucky we made it back home. In the mid-2000s, I was in college out in eastern central Ohio, near Zanesville. There was a small bit of wood that hadn't been developed over behind campus, and within the woods was an old shelter house that had been locked up and had bars over the windows. Sometimes you'd swear you would feel eyes watching you from that building. In addition, you'd find random ritual circles out in the woods themselves, usually near the old collapsed buildings. One specific time, I remember being around campus during a break in the fall, and I went to walk through the woods to sit by a pond behind it. I sat around for longer than I planned, so it was approaching sunset when I started to walk back, and by the time I crossed the threshold of the trees, everything felt wrong. It was eerily quiet, and I immediately felt goosebumps all over. Everything in me was screaming panic, but to my knowledge, there are no major predators that close to campus. Regardless, I started to pick up my pace since that feeling only got worse, and after a minute or two, I was basically running. As soon as I broke out of the tree cover, all those feelings stopped, and it felt perfectly normal. An important thing to note is that the distance I had to go was maybe 1,000 feet through the woods, and I could see all the way to the other side. I never walked out there at night by myself after that. On a different occasion, I went driving south of campus late at night because I couldn't sleep and just decided to wander around. I had done this several times in the past, so I had a loose route that I took, except I decided to take a different turn this time to see where it went. I do not know what road I turned onto, but it eventually turned to dirt and gravel, admittedly not super surprising in rural Ohio, but then it just came to a stop at a fence with a little turnaround circle of dirt. I was extremely confused and didn't have GPS, so I couldn't look up where I ended up, but I could swear I saw human-shaped movement in the fields and trees on the other side of the fence. I quickly turned around and got away from there. A day or so later, I had told a couple friends about this, and we tried to find that spot again, but I couldn't. I checked maps, digital and physical, but I either had no concept for where I was, entirely possible, or something weird happened. Rural Ohio is weird and creepy sometimes. This is not my own story but was told to me by a coworker whom I trust and respect. This man is an outdoorsman and not prone to hyperbole or any kind of nonsense. This took place in East Tennessee in the 90s or early 2000s, as far as I know. He's out parked in his truck in a state forest area with a girl late at night. They drank a few beers, so take it as you will. It's a clear night in the winter time, so there's no undergrowth, there's rolling hills and hardwood forest with leaf cover on the ground. It was a clear night with lots of moonlight. I don't remember if he heard something or if he just saw it, but he saw a werewolf-type creature running through the trees and up the hill. It was large, tall, and on two legs. It was silhouetted by the moonlight on a ridge line, and he and the girl hightailed it out of there in the truck. If you're familiar with the stories of the Dogman, it sounds like this is what he says he saw. I know there's more to the story, but this is all that I can remember. I've hiked through this area myself dozens of times in the daytime, and I've never seen anything, but it's a pretty desolate section of forest that something like this could have the freedom to move through without much trouble from people. This is probably the strangest, potentially paranormal thing that's happened to me. I grew up in East Tennessee. My dad's backyard was not so much a yard as it was a very steep hill leading up to a patch of woods. A trail led from my dad's property into the woods and eventually to a children's home on the other side of this wooded area. Anyway, my childhood friend and I would often go mess around in the woods, having pretend adventures, etc. On one such occasion, we both saw something up in a tree. I should say most of these trees were quite tall, with few branches to climb on. So this thing was very high up in the tree and was coming down the trunk backwards and circling the trunk on its way down. Our first thought was that it was a cub or adolescent bear. This was in town, mind you, so that would be unusual but still not unheard of. But, frozen in fear and curiosity, we watched it come all the way down the tree and got a pretty close look at it. Not a bear cub. Maybe there are 10 meters between us and the creature. It wasn't a bear, and it wasn't a bobcat, no bobcats are that close to town, and this was in daylight. It was a solid gray and seemingly alone. We looked at it looked at us, and we booked it back to the house. I still have no clue what it could have been. The Wampus cat is a regional legend, and it crossed my mind at the time, but I just don't know. There's a campsite I know of in a national forest near me that people say is haunted. I won't stay there, but my friends consistently say that they have terrible nightmares and sleepwalk when they otherwise wouldn't. There's also supposedly been times where people have heard talking off in the woods. It's in a very remote bit of woods, like a 45-minute backcountry hike and on deer trails with nothing around but more national forest, and when they responded, there was only silence. Creepy stuff, but nothing conclusive. I've been there, and it's pretty eerie, but I wouldn't say there's anything there that stands out to me as particularly scary. Every year around Father's Day, all the men old enough to do so come up to a cabin built by our family in the northern LP of Michigan, the General Huron National Forest area. Of age being around 10 to 12. The rules are simple. 1. Do whatever the hell you want, as long as someone knows generally where you will be and how long you plan to take, and 2. Don't be an asshole. We generally tend to wind down as it approaches sunset, as night is when people get to heavier drinking, playing euchre or checkers while talking shit, and the like. I myself have been up here a few times at this point, so I'm fairly comfortable with the area. This was about 5 years ago, so I'd be around 13. Just teen enough to start being a dumbass. Anyways, everyone else is being lazy, but I still have a fire to get out and move, so I plan to go frog hunting with my BB gun at the smaller secondary pond on the 80 acres our cabin rests on. The path to this pond is pretty much a straight shot, turned 90 degrees about halfway through in a crude L. In all, it's not far, maybe a quarter of a mile in total length, or a third. Getting my gear together, I prepare to be out into the darkness, seeing as the sun is alright casting orange light. I grab my BB gun, a good flashlight, and toss on a hoodie, since it would definitely get chillier as it got later. With my stuff ready, I proceed. The first leg of the L goes fine, with me just thinking to myself and enjoying the wilderness. I reach the point to turn, and as I do so, before I notice anything else, a phantom chill runs up my spine. Something is definitely not right. Shaking it off, I look down the path, almost striding, before I notice something odd. A black, roughly man-shaped figure was cast against a tree about halfway between me and the pond. It's getting late, as I said, so I assume it's just a shadow. Still, I guess my body thinks something is up, so I instinctively shine my flashlight down the path to shut up my mindless fears. The light reflects off of its eyes. Immediately everything changes, and my eyes go wide. I have no idea at all what the duck I'm dealing with now. As I hastily shut off the flashlight, I pay more close attention to the thing down the path, and I notice it's moving. Not moving towards me, but that slow back and forth motion of someone sizing up an opponent just before a brawl, trying to decide if they are worth it. Needless to say, at this point, I'm doing all that I can to not leave brown stains in my underwear. Staring down at it, I know that at the very least I need to not be here immediately. Luckily, as there had been black bear sightings recently in the area, I had gotten some advice on what I had to do to avoid angering a bear on the off chance I ran into it. I backed exceedingly slowly out of sight around the corner, making sure to not make any further eye contact with whatever was waiting for me at the tree on that path. Getting out of its line of sight, I run faster than I ever had in the past and likely ever will, getting back to camp in a fraction of the time it took me to leave. As I return to camp breathlessly, everyone else can see the look of abject horror on my face. Immediately explaining myself, my dad and uncle forced me and my cousin into an impromptu hunting party for whatever the hell may have been out there, but it is gone. Years pass, and we finally think to at least get an idea of what I was actually seeing that day, so while back at the cabin, we do a quick size check. My 6 feet 5 inches grandfather walks down the path until I stop him in front of the correct tree and raise his arm. It's easy for me to tell, compared to him, how tall the creature stood, as the image of his eyes will never leave my brain. I do a double take and quickly realize that his eyes would have been on his watch. At its bare minimum, this thing was 9 feet tall, likely more. So when I was younger, 16 or 17, I think, I had an encounter with something strange in the forest near Danbury, Wisconsin. Background on me is that I am 6 feet 4 inches and athletic. I am a hunter, camper, and martial artist, generally a survivalist. I was naive and didn't give nature the proper level of respect, and I was basically a cocky teenager who felt invincible. Our cabin had been on Long Lake in Danbury, Wisconsin. The whole area is forested for the most part. I was there on vacation with my cousin and grandparents. It was a nice and hot summer day, and we had decided to play airsoft. I took airsoft really seriously, and I wore a full BDU Woodland with a camouflage mask even. My cousin just wore jeans and a t-shirt. We had a battle, which I took into the woods where I felt comfortable. We were about 150 meters into the forest when we stopped, and then I decided to tease my cousin. I shushed him and said, we were being watched, jokingly. Unfortunately, it turned out to not be much of a joke, because I immediately noticed that the woods were dead quiet, which only happens when a large predator is around. I was on edge very quickly. Next, the feeling of being watched hit hard, so I started scanning the surrounding area. When I saw it, the whitish teeth gave it away. What I saw was at the edge of a clearing about 40 meters from us, crouched and holding on to a tree with its left hand. It was panting and watching us with its ears up. It had reddish-brown hair or fur and looked canine. In my head, it clicked like a werewolf. I said to my cousin, we have to go, and he bolted. I still had my eyes on it when my cousin started sprinting. The creature charged. It ran on 2 legs for maybe 10 feet and then dropped to all 4s. Then I turned and sprinted. I could hear it crashing through the woods behind us, the ones who ran out of the woods. Once back at the cabin, we discussed it. It's still unclear if my cousin saw it. I told him I thought it was a bear to not freak him out, but I know bears. It wasn't a bear. I started doing research on these things after my encounter, which brought me to many dog-related sites. What I saw coincided with other people's sightings. I am now far better about respecting nature, and I am extremely cautious with the forests. If I go into nature alone, I am always armed, but I prefer not to be alone. Always trust your senses. When I was about 12, I was out hunting. I grew up in NC and at the time was an avid outdoorsman type and often had to hunt or fish to eat. Times were different and harder back then, and I don't hunt anymore. I can't stand it. At home, with no success, something presumably large and very noisy began to follow me through the woods. I left the woods for a farmer's path that followed along its edge, but the rustling noise continued to follow me, crashing along about 20 to 30 yards from the path. At one point, I stopped and just looked into the woods, trying to see if it was a bear, a rabid deer, or something. It got quiet then, but all of a sudden pine cones began to fall from trees near me, and a noise that I'll never forget began screeching at me at a very high volume. I can only describe it as being like an evil primal sound. I've never heard anything else like it aside from when monkeys get angry, but it was worse than that. It sounded extremely menacing and angry. My blood ran cold, my skin bumped up, and I felt electrified. I was dead-ass horrified in a way I've never experienced before or after. I fired the single shot. I was carrying it into the trees above me and duck and book it down the path. The thing followed me, now seeming to stay up higher in the trees, and kept howling every few seconds, and the trees shook so much that when I looked back, I could clearly see them moving as it moved through them. I had to run about 1/4 of a mile down this path until I reached a lake, then run along the path by the lake for about 1/8 of a mile until I reached my yard on the other side of the lake. I managed to reload and fire my gun in its direction 2 more times along the way, to absolutely no effect. I don't know how I managed that, but I remember dropping a few shells trying to reload because doing so at a full sprint and while terrified is almost impossible. It followed as far as the woods allowed, never giving up the chase, and even as I crossed an almost half-acre yard and ran to my front door, I could hear it screaming at me from the wood edge. I was so scared that when I got to the door, I couldn't get it open at first. After a few seconds, I got in and slammed the door behind me. The howling noises stopped as soon as the door shut. No one was home at the time. I was freaked out pretty badly and struggling to rationalize the situation. I was so ducked up I didn't know what to do and just sat there in shock with my back to the door as if I thought I needed to hold it shut or something. After doing that for maybe 10 minutes or so, I sat down in the recliner and kept my gun aimed at the door. At some point, I fell asleep. My parents came home a few hours later and found me passed out on the floor by the chair. The .410 was still loaded but had been put on the gun rack in my room. I had no explanation for that, but I was shaken, so who knows? I don't go into the woods anymore. If, for some reason, I have to, I go heavily armed and never alone. There's some shit in there, man. Growing up in the mountains of North Georgia, camping and hiking were things me and my brother did so often, it was second nature. So anytime Ryan and I had a break from school, we would head straight for the woods. We packed our gear, let our parents know where we were going, and that was that, no questions asked. We decided to camp about midway through the Jacks River Trail in the Cohutta Wilderness, and it's a trail we knew fairly well, as we had used it a few times before to practice long hikes. We arrived at the trailhead around lunchtime, parked the car, got our gear out, and headed into the woods. We moved deeper into the trail and started to look for a place to make camp. This is where Ryan and I made our first mistake. You see, Ryan and I have this rule. We don't camp near people if at all possible. Call us paranoid, but the last thing we want is for someone to drag us out of our tents and into the woods, never to be seen again. So we always camped pretty decently off the trail and in an area that wasn't popular with overnight camping. After roughly 2.5 hours or so, we found what we thought was the perfect place to set up for the 2 nights that we would be out. We came up to Horseshoe Bend and ventured about half a mile off the trail into a clearing and set up. We built a teepee fire pit for that night and pitched our tents on either side. After setting up and unloading, we decided to walk back to the trail and go exploring some of the many swimming holes Jacks River had to offer. This was during Thanksgiving break, and I remember being surprised at how few people were on the trail. Around 5 o'clock, Ryan and I headed back to camp to start our fire, make dinner, and settle in for the night. As soon as the sun began to set, the cold rushed in. We added more wood to the fire, sat close, and just enjoyed conversation. Around 9, we were settled comfortably around the fire. And I remember we were talking about dreading going to our grandparents' house for Thanksgiving and having the same awkward conversations we had each year with family we only saw on holidays when things started to get strange. We were no strangers to sounds in the woods, and these woods were full of animals, from deer to black bears and even the random wild boar. If you are in the woods enough, you learn to distinguish certain sounds, and what we were hearing I can only chalk up to being odd. What Ryan and I heard was what sounded like someone sneaking around slowly, just out of sight. With an animal walking on 4 legs, you hear a tighter group of steps, but what we were hearing sounded very distinct from what a human sounds like when walking slowly or trying to move without making much sound. I remember we both pulled out our flashlights and showed them in the direction we felt the sounds were coming from, but that is what was so weird. Whenever we would fix our lights on a spot, we thought the sound was coming from, but the location of the sound would suddenly change. It was as if there were multiple people walking around us. That's when the whistling started. At first, I thought it was the wind, and I remember thinking maybe the wind is just throwing leaves around, and what we are hearing is nothing but the wilderness around us. Ryan looked at me and asked if I was hearing that. I didn't answer and was trying to focus hard on each individual sound. 2 consecutive notes with roughly a 3 to 4 second gap, and then 2 more consecutive notes. Over and over again. Ryan kept asking if I heard that, and I put my finger to my lips, trying to keep him from talking. The fear I felt was incredible. My jaw was tight, and my fist was clenched, knowing I wasn't ready for whatever was out there, if it was anything at all. The whistling continued for what felt like forever, but thinking it through, it was maybe 5 minutes when Ryan finally yelled out into the darkness. "Hey! Quiet!" The whistling stopped. The crunching of the wood stopped. Nothing. I was pissed. I looked at Ryan with a what the hell look, and he shrugged his shoulders. "I had to do something," he said. I just shook my head. We sat there in silence for a few minutes when the woods erupted with noise. Something or someone was running in a circle around our campsite. The whistling came back. 2 consecutive notes with the same 3 to 4 second gap, and then 2 more consecutive notes. How could someone whistle this loudly without cracking while also running? I was done. I stood up, shining my flashlight in all directions, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever was screwing with us. Nothing. It felt close enough to touch, but we never saw a thing. That's when the movement stopped, but the whistling was still constant. It was so loud. Inhumanly loud. I looked at Ryan and told him to call the police. Now this is the part I will never forget. The part I never liked to talk about. While Ryan was on the phone with the dispatcher, telling them our location and what was going on, I stepped around the fire towards my tent. Inside my bag, I had a 6-inch fixed blade that I always carried, and I thought I would feel a bit more comfortable with it in my hand than with just my flashlight. As I went to unzip my tent, trying to keep my eyes towards the woods, I heard some movement directly in front of me. I swept my light up in front of me, and for maybe 2 seconds, I saw it. Whatever this person or thing was, it was about 5 feet up in a tree. Everything about it was long. Its arms, legs, neck, fingers, everything, and it was fast. As soon as the light hit, it launched backwards off the tree. I heard it land, but it either jumped an impossible distance or landed in a thicket because I heard it but never saw it. I don't think I have ever yelled so loud. I ran back to where Ryan was and sat down. He kept asking me what I saw, but I couldn't answer. I just kept thinking about what I saw. Maybe 10 minutes later, we saw a couple of flashlight beams coming through the woods, and about 3 guys came into view, asking if everything was okay. I settled a bit and started asking them if they had seen or heard anything. All they said was that they heard a lot of movement and then heard my scream, and that's when they headed in our direction. I tried to explain what had happened without sounding crazy, but it didn't seem to work. One of the guys walked around a bit, came back, and said he didn't see anything. Ryan told them that we called the police, and roughly 30 minutes later, a park ranger showed up. Ryan and I tried explaining everything to him, but he just chalked it up to either a curious animal or some campers trying to mess with us. Either way, Ryan and I decided we weren't staying the night. We packed our stuff up and walked out of the woods with the ranger. He took our statement, and we got in our car and drove home. Ryan and I don't talk about what happened that night, but neither of us have been back to Jack's River Trail and will probably never go back. When I was about 8 or 9, I visited my relative's apartment with my mom. My father bought me a cute doll from overseas, and I wanted to show it to everyone in that household. While my mom was talking to the relatives, I decided to visit their neighbor's apartment. I knew them well, and I had been to their place many times. I went to that flat and greeted some family members sitting in the living room. I then took the stairs to go to the upper floor. I remember the upper floor being dark, and the only light was coming from the veranda. I saw 2 family members sitting and talking. I went to them, showed them my doll, and walked back to the dark hallway to reach the stairs that would take me back to the first floor. That's when I saw a woman walk into the room at the back of the hallway. From the back, she looked so much like one of the women who lived in that flat. I thought of following her into the room, as I wanted to show her my doll. Before I entered that room, I became very scared for some reason. Part of the reason may be because the room was pitch black, and I was confused as to why she wouldn't turn on the light. I was worried she might hide in the corner, trying to jump at me in the dark. So I decided not to go into the room and went downstairs, only to find that woman in the kitchen on the first floor. I didn't see her on my way in, but she had been downstairs all along. I told her what I saw upstairs, and she exchanged a funny look with another family member there and just brushed me off. By the way, there were no guests in the house. I don't know who I saw. I told my mom about it later, too. She also brushed it off, but I later overheard her talking to my dad about some funny things going on in that apartment after they brought in a harp-like musical instrument. My mom said they would hear someone playing the harp at night, and when they checked, the sound would stop. From where I come from, there are beliefs and warnings about mimics. For example, hikers and hunters are told not to call each other by their real names, as mimics can lure them and make them feel lost by calling their names in the voice of someone they know. They could also trick you by looking like your friends and making you follow them. This is something that happened to my husband and me 9 years ago. We had gone to watch a friend's band play and were headed home from downtown Dallas. I don't live in the Metroplex any longer, so not personal info. It was around 1 a.m., but we still had plans before I was expected home, still dating at the time, so we headed to his apartment in one of the South Dallas suburbs. This is a pretty well-populated suburb, but by the time we got close to his apartment, the roads were pretty much empty. We exited the highway and turned onto the street that led to his apartment. But as soon as we passed the traffic light under the highway, we both saw it, plain as day. Stone sober and wide awake, we both saw a mother effing werewolf-type creature exit a neighborhood street and calmly run, in about 4 steps, across a 4-lane road. It was about 75 yards in front of us. But it wasn't exactly the way I'd imagine a werewolf. It was completely canine, no human features at all except for the fact that it was on 2 legs. The legs were massive, and the thing was about 7 feet tall, but the arms reminded me of T-Rex arms. They were small and still hung like dog legs. They seemed very useless if they were trying to attack something. The head was also odd. Besides being a typical dog color, grayish-black, the eyes were bright, glowing yellow, even when there weren't headlights shining directly in them. It didn't look like the glow an animal gets from lights in their eyes anyway. But the thing that stood out to me the most was that the eyes were binocular, like a fish. I saw the eyes clearly, even though he was completely profiled for us. The road we were driving on had heavy trees on the right side of us. When it came out, it was running but crossed this road in just a few steps. It was big enough and effortlessly fast enough to know that a human couldn't have dressed up and done this. There was an open field that he ran into. When my husband and I got to where the trees broke, we both turned our heads to look, but it was long gone by then, about 4 seconds. I think the only thing that was said was a quiet "what the duck?" by me. This story takes place when I was 15 or so in Middle Tennessee. Back then, I was going through my edgy phase, as we all do, and I thought it was cool to go into the wood alone to blow off steam and whatnot. I spent a lot of time with my grandma, as my dad worked 6 days a week and didn't feel comfortable leaving me home alone since we lived in a sort of sketchy meth head town, whereas my grandma lived in a relatively nicer area. She owns a good few acres of land, and if you go far enough into the woods, there's this beautiful waterfall that leads to an underground spring. One day I was going back there, trekking the land I knew like the back of my hand at that point, enjoying the peacefulness the wilderness had to offer. After going uphill for a bit, when it starts downhill, there's this clearing that will take you straight to the waterfall. Watching my feet as I walked, always cautious as to not step on a copperhead, I came down the hill to the clearing. Right at the bottom of the hill, something unusual caught my eye. It took me a second to realize what I was staring at, but it was the skeleton of a deer, freshly killed. Now normally, I wouldn't think too much of this, but something felt off. There was no rotted skin or signs of flesh anywhere. These bones still had fresh blood on them, but no sign of skin or anything. My young teenage mind tried to process this, and I couldn't think of any predator that lived in this area that could just strip a deer like this, and no hunter would just dump the bones in this area because this was not an area where hunters were known to hunt. The moment I realized that this was very wrong, a sense of impending doom washed over me. My fight or flight kicked in. It felt like the trees and ground all around me and even above me were moving, shaking like something fast was coming towards me. I took off as fast as I could, not even looking behind me, but I could sense that something was chasing after me. I heard the twigs and sticks break under the weight of something behind me, running fast after me. I don't think I ever ran that fast in my life. Once I was out of the clearing of the woods and back in my grandma's backyard, the feeling of safety washed over me. I don't know what was in those woods that day, but needless to say, I didn't hike back there alone ever again. Not my story, but a friend's. He was passing through Yosemite after a music festival for the first time in his life. He explained that once he stepped out of the car, he immediately felt at home because of how stunningly beautiful and huge Yosemite is. He was in awe. He got back inside the car, and he and his friend hit stop traffic. Out of the corner of his eye, outside of the passenger window, he saw a man standing there in a bright red and black checkered shirt and blue jeans for a couple seconds and said that he had just disappeared. There is no logical explanation. He looked around to see if he could find where the man in the red shirt could have gone, and he didn't see him. Instantly, he had an intense feeling of dread wash over him and felt that he needed to get out of there right the duck now. He described the feeling of urgency as his intuition screaming at him. But in addition, he had this very strong feeling of wanting to stay as well. Something was persuading him that Yosemite is home and that he likes it here. These clashing feelings made him so uneasy that he's never had the desire to go back and experience more of Yosemite. I don't blame him. I was driving down this little mountain road, looking for a place to camp. It was already the middle of the night and pitch black outside. I'm probably 50 miles from nowhere when I see a young woman stumbling down the road. I pull over and try to ask if she needs some help. I look away for a split second to push the shit out of my passenger seat, and when I look back, she is gone. I got out and ran a little ways back down the road, but I couldn't find her. No footprints or anything. I made it back to my car and continued driving. About a mile up or so, I come across a log in the road. I got out to move the log, and off to the right there was a car wrapped around a tree. A stream was still rising from the engine. I checked it out. The cab was completely caved in, but I could see a mat of bloody blonde hair squished against the driver's window. There were two other bodies a few yards from the vehicle. All three of them were dead. My girlfriend and I went on a 14-mile backpacking trip to a beautiful and remote mountain lake. We arrived at the site at sunset and rapidly set up our camp. We were exhausted, but everything was good. First night sleeping there, nothing unusual. The second night, however, let me tell you guys about the second night. My girl and I had settled in our tent for the night. We had a lantern hanging up inside the tent for light, and we were just chilling and talking. Suddenly, we hear distinct bipedal footsteps approach the tent. Whatever, I mean, other people do hike and camp in this area, so whatever, it's not too strange, I guess. We were a little weirded out, but we didn't bother looking out at that point just yet. Then it gets freaky and continues walking right up to the tent. This time we're like, okay, WTF, and we pause and go silent, and we're just listening. A short time passes, and we forget about it. Now once more we hear footsteps approaching, but this time they're much faster and it sounds like it's running at the tent. I had a rifle, so I grabbed it and got ready. My girl had a knife, and we no shit braced for whoever this was. We did not feel like it was an animal. Nothing happened. It ran at the tent, and the sound vanished. We got out because we were done being ducked with and were ready to fight if need be. We look around with flashlights and nothing. No sign of anything or anyone. It was the most raw adrenaline rush I've ever gotten while camping, hiking, etc. It still freaks us out to this day when we talk about it. We grew up in a rural area in the mountains. Dirt road switchback, the whole thing. Anywho, we were coming home from school, so maybe 4:00-ish, when we noticed distinct drag marks across the dirt road. I pulled over and got out to inspect, and I found a dead deer down from the road in this little flat area before it dropped off down a very steep mountainside. Blood still looked fresh, and no tire tracks had gone over the drag makers yet, so it seemed like it had happened recently. Once we found the deer, we hopped back into our vehicle. We have bears, mountain lions, etc. And we didn't want to be too near a recent kill. A few days later, my mom, sister, and I decided to walk the backside of the property towards the road where we saw the drag marks. We ended up crossing onto our neighbor's property. They were never there and said they didn't mind if we walked around, and kept going until we started to notice old blood spatter. Now this is in an arid part of the Pacific Northwest, so it was more filled with tall grass and sagebrush with pine trees. There was not a lot of undergrowth, and we could see for a mile or two in every direction because this particular stretch of land was devoid of hardly any pine trees. We were still about a mile from where the deer was on the opposite side of the road. All of a sudden, we heard the loudest dog panting sound ever. It sounded like it was all around us in an instant. We were all so confused, and I remember glancing around, thinking maybe one of our dogs had gotten out and chased us down here. The grass was only about calf to knee height, and we could not figure out where the sound was coming from. It was loud. And then it just stopped. Just silence. At this point, all three of us were spooked, and we booked it home. I could never see or figure out what made the sound. Needless to say, we did not venture down that way for a long time afterward. When I was younger, around 14 or 15 years old, my family used to camp at a state park. Every night, my friend and I would walk through the woods. We called this the ritual. This particular night, we decided to walk further into the woods than usual. We had flashlights, and we liked to try and navigate through the woods with them turned off. We were about half a mile from the nearest campsite when we heard soft whispering behind us. Obviously, we hit the flashlights and spun around. I didn't see anything. So we kept walking, and we heard it again. This time we stopped and looked around a bit before we decided to head back to our campsite. Then we see what's whispering. It's a lady crawling on the ground, whispering just random words. She was wearing dark clothes and was covered in dirt. When she sees that we notice her, she stands up and declares that she is looking for her campsite. We ended up walking her back to the campground and trying to help her find her group. It turns out she was just super drunk or high and got lost trying to find a bathroom. Her friends didn't even notice she was missing, and if we hadn't gone that far into the woods, she would have been lost all night. It was pretty creepy. I grew up in the Pacific Northwest and was an avid hiker. In 2013, a group of friends invited me to go mushroom hunting in the Shasla National Forest, about an hour outside of Portland, where we lived. We spent significant time in the coastal forests, but mushrooms tended to cluster in areas with lighter foliage cover. Our de facto expert had experience foraging off of old logging roads and suggested a spot he visited the year prior. We drove to the end of a one-lane dirt road overlooking a deep ravine. Each of us put on our gear and bushwhacked through the, comparatively sparse, undergrowth, checking the leaves and debris for fungi. After about 20 minutes, I came across a small clearing of trees, perhaps a one-time campsite for loggers. About halfway across the span, I noticed something pink on the ground ahead. What I saw stopped me dead in my tracks. Resting on the leaves was the heart of an unknown animal, roughly the size of my fist, still untouched by the elements and fauna. There was no trace of a body in the immediate area, there were no other organs, remnants of flesh, or visible blood. It was spotless. The heart had no bite marks, and the tissue was still dark red. I ran like hell back to the car. Mercifully, my friend decided to hang back. We rounded everyone up and left immediately. I'd like to share an encounter I had in 2005 or 2006. I was 10 or 11 years old at the time, and it happened on my grandparents' property, out in the country near Denmark, which is southeast of Green Bay. The land out there is a lot of farmland, with patches of wood. My grandparents own a few acres of land, and on the far right corner of their yard there's a thick patch of woods and swamp that goes on for a bit before hitting another farm field. I was standing on the back deck, shooting cans with my BB gun. It was a hot and muggy morning in July, and all morning outside, I just had a really eerie feeling that I couldn't shake. It was like I was being watched, but every time I'd look around the yard, I never saw anything. I just kept going back to shooting cans when I felt the feeling again. I started scanning the tree line of the woods this time, and that's when I saw it. It was standing next to a tree, and it was absolutely massive. When I got older, I went back to that tree and tried to get an estimate on its height. I'd say it was 7 to 7.5 feet tall. The only way I can compare the body is to Arnold Schwarzenegger's. It's unreal how big his shoulders, arms, and chest were. It was covered in gray fur that was really shaggy and thick on its shoulders and down part of its body. I know when people describe dogmen, you hear a lot of it looked like a timber wolf standing on two legs, or it had the head of a German shepherd. This was not that at all. The head and face looked like a werewolf. It had pointed ears on top of its head, its eyes were yellow and almost seemed to glow even in the daylight, it was snarling with its lips open, and it almost seemed to be smiling. The look and smile on this thing's face were pure evil. Sinister is the only way I can describe it. I don't recall if it had a tail or not, and I feel like the legs looked like those of a human and were not bent like those of a dog. However, I was mostly looking at the head and body. After what had to be only about 10 seconds but felt like hours, without warning, it broke eye contact with me and took off sprinting to its right. It went through some really thick brush, emerged farther down the tree line, and took off into the woods. The thing is, no person could clear what it cleared in the time that it did. It was seconds before it ran probably 50 to 60 yards, and it was all thick brush through there. Being absolutely terrified, I went back in the house and didn't go outside the rest of the day. Funnily enough, my aunt came up to me later and said, "I heard some strange things outside last night. I've been meaning to tell you, but I didn't want to freak you out." I didn't tell her what I saw, thinking she'd think I was crazy or making it up, but I insisted she tell me. She said she heard a loud growling and snarling walking around the house the previous night, Unlike anything she's ever heard before. I still visit my grandparents quite often and haven't seen anything since. I haven't heard of any other reports from the area, but I know there was a Bigfoot road crossing just down the road back in the 60s or 70s.